Let's just jump right into it. We all know the name Pablo Picasso, right? We hear the name and instantly picture those fractured faces and crazy abstract shapes. But what actually drove that incredibly radical vision? Well, in this explainer, we're going to explore how one of the most famous names of the 20th century spent an entire childhood mastering the rigid rules of art, literally just so he could spend the next 7 decades completely shattering them.
So you really have to ask yourself, how does one person redefine art that many times in a single lifetime? Rather than just walking through a dry chronological list of his paintings, we're going to dig into the deeply personal and honestly often traumatic events that fueled this relentless need to reinvent his style. Because for him, art wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was a raw, psychological reaction to the world around him.
Here's the roadmap for our explainer today. We're going to trace his rapid evolution through distinct eras, starting with the somber 1901 blue period into the 1904 rose period, the 1907 African period, and then the birth of Cubism in 1909.
Section 1. The Prodigy's Early Years. Okay, let's go back to the beginning in Malaga, Spain, 1881. He was born to a father who was a super traditional academic art instructor, the kind of guy who believed true art only came from disciplined copying. So young Pablo was steeped in this rigorous old-school world right from day one.
But here's the thing. He outpaced his own teacher incredibly early. There's this telling story, maybe slightly apocryphal, but it hits the nail on the head, that one day his dad walked in and found 13-year-old Picasso painting over his unfinished sketch of a pigeon. The kid's precision was so astonishing that his father reportedly just handed over his brushes, feeling completely outmatched, and vowed to give up painting entirely right then and there.
But that soaring early confidence, it hit a brick wall of tragedy. In 1895, his 7-year-old little sister, Conchita, died of diphtheria. As you can imagine, this deeply traumatized him. The family packed up and moved to Barcelona, and soon after, he was sent off to Madrid's ultra-prestigious Royal Academy. But he was grieving. He was restless. So he started actively rejecting all that formal instruction, and he famously just dropped out of the country's top art school at only 16 years old. He was searching for something they just couldn't teach.
Section 2. Blue and Rose Periods. The key takeaway here is that his art was never, ever isolated from his emotional state.
By 1901, he was bouncing between Barcelona and Paris, totally broke. But the real breaking point, the true catalyst for his famous blue period, was the tragic suicide of his close friend Carlos Casagemas. Plunged into this intense grief, Picasso started painting almost exclusively in these cold, pervasive shades of blue and blue-green. And his subjects? Society's absolute most destitute. Gaunt mothers, beggars, recurring themes of blindness. It perfectly captured his own profound sense of isolation.
But eventually the clouds kind of parted. He settled into Parisian life, met a bohemian artist named Fernande Olivier who became his mistress, and the entire mood shifted. His palette suddenly warmed up to these vibrant oranges and pinks. We call this the Rose Period. Those somber beggars were swapped out for lively circus performers and acrobats, and specifically the comedic Harlequin emerged as this optimistic, personal symbol for Picasso himself. Now, as he got more famous, he caught the eye of some major American art patrons in Paris, like the writer Gertrude Stein, and this is where we see his incredible confidence. He painted her portrait, and some critics actually had the nerve to point out that it didn't really look like her. His response? She will. I mean, the sheer arrogance of that. He wasn't trying to capture reality anymore, he was literally dictating it.
Section 3. The Cubist Revolution. You'd think with fame and money coming in, he'd just settle down, right? No way. He was ready to completely tear down the foundation of Western art.
In 1907, he drops Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Inspired by Iberian sculpture and African artifacts, he painted these figures with violently distorted geometric faces and jagged bodies. It was so aggressively radical that his own friends were horrified. His rival Henri Matisse was actually angry, dismissing the whole thing as a hoax. The reaction was so intense that Picasso kept it hidden in his studio for years.
But obviously, that didn't stop him. Working side by side with Georges Braque, he developed Cubism in 2 totally distinct phases. First, analytic Cubism. That's where they essentially smashed objects apart, using these monochromatic, brownish tones to analyze shapes from a bunch of angles all at once. And then they leveled up to synthetic Cubism. This is where they actually started pasting real-world stuff, like chunks of newspaper and oilcloth, right onto the canvas. By doing that, they basically co-invented the modern collage.
They were rebuilding reality from everyday scraps.
Section 4. Neoclassicism and Surrealism. So just as Cubism makes him the ultimate avant-garde rebel, World War I erupts, completely scattering his circle of friends.
And what does he do? He pulls a move that completely shocked the art world. He visits Italy, marries a high society Russian ballerina named Olga Koklova, and totally pivots. Influenced by this new fancy lifestyle and a post-war craving for stability across Europe, he starts painting in this highly structured traditional neoclassical style. We're talking portraits that looked more like Raphael than the guy who just invented Cubism. People call this his return to order.
But let's be real, order just wasn't his thing. The rigid expectations of his marriage started clashing with his bohemian soul. So by the mid-1920s, his art takes this really dark psychological turn. He gets embraced by the surrealist movement and completely ditches classical proportions to tap into psychic fears, violence, and eroticism. This is when the Minotaur, the mythical half-man, half-bull, starts showing up everywhere as a symbol of his own internal conflicts.
Section 5. Guernica and World War II. Up until the late 1930s, he mostly kept politics out of his art, but global events were about to force his hand.
He was dating the surrealist photographer and anti-fascist activist Dora Maar, and she really pushed him politically. Horrified by the brutal German bombing of a Spanish town during the Spanish Civil War, he created his ultimate masterpiece, Guernica. Maar actually photographed him working on it, and likely influenced by her black and white photos, he painted this massive, dramatic anti-war canvas entirely in stark grays, blacks, and whites. It became this universally devastating symbol of war's brutality.
When World War II broke out, he flat out refused to leave Paris, even with the Nazis occupying the city. The regime hated his art, and he got harassed a lot. And there's this legendary story that just perfectly captures his quiet defiance. A Gestapo officer was tossing his apartment, saw a photo of Guernica on the table, sneered at it, and asked, "Did you do that?" Picasso just coldly looked at him and said, "No, you did."
Section 6. A legacy of reinvention. Now, heading into the final chapters of his life, settling into these massive villas in the south of France with his second wife, you'd expect him to finally just chill out and stick to one style. Nope. Right up until his death, he was churning out this massive torrent of super colorful canvases and etchings. At the time, critics brushed them off. They called them the slapdash, frantic fantasies of an old man who lost his touch. But guess what? History proved him right again. Art historians today look at those vibrant final works and realize he was totally ahead of his time, basically setting the stage for the neo-expressionist movement that exploded years after he died.
76. Take a second to really think about that number. That is how many years this single artist actively worked. From painting as a Spanish teenager in the 1890s, to inventing Cubism, to designing massive 50-foot public sculptures in the late 60s, right up until he died at age 91 in 1973. The man literally never stopped moving.
And that really brings us to the core of what we've been talking about today. When you look at his art, not just as paint on a canvas, but as the visual diary of a deeply restless innovator reacting to a chaotic world, it completely shifts how you see it, doesn't it? So, considering his constant evolution in response to all that love, loss, and war, which chapter of his incredible life speaks most deeply to yours? Think about that next time you're looking at modern art. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. We'll see you next time.